A 19th century courthouse. Columns, domes, stone too precise, too massive. In the old world narrative, this was not built, it was reassigned. I opened the archive to trace the first record of that claim. Like, subscribe and drop your theory below. A city hall from 1888. Granite blocks, ornate pediments. No visible construction photos in the viral posts. In the Tartaria and Old World narrative, this building was never truly constructed in the 19th century. The claim says it was inherited, rebranded, given a new architect and a convenient date, part of a larger reset. I pulled the earliest record of this idea, not the building, the claim itself. I checked the first forum posts, early YouTube uploads, archived blogs. I compared language. I tracked which structures were named first. The first trace appears much later than most assume, and this is where the pattern shifts. The argument is rarely framed as demolition. It is framed as reassignment. According to the Tartaria narrative, governments did not build the monumental architecture of the 1800s. They occupied it. They cataloged it. They renamed it. Courthouses, capitals, train stations, exhibition halls, cathedrals. The pattern repeats across the United States, across Europe, across parts of Russia. Massive stone facades, classical columns, domes, sculptural detail that feels older than the official plaque. The claim forms around three pillars. First, scale. The buildings look too large for what is assumed to be a developing 19th century society. The argument suggests population numbers, industrial capacity, and transportation infrastructure were insufficient for such rapid construction. Second, speed. Some structures were reportedly completed in a few years. The claim frames this as implausible. Too fast, the posts say. No way they built this from scratch. Third, visual absence. Viral threads often present finished photographs but omit construction stages. The silence becomes evidence. If scaffolding images are missing from a post, the absence is treated as proof of inheritance. This is where language evolves. Early discussions used old world structures. Later, the term Tartaria appears more frequently. Eventually, reset narrative and rebranding enter the vocabulary. The claim becomes more specific, not only inherited but deliberately reattributed. In many videos, the script follows a template. A building is shown. The official completion date appears on screen. Then, the narrator questions the feasibility. Who funded this? Where are the workers? Why so advanced? The conclusion is implied. It predates the assigned history. I began listing which buildings appear most often. The U.S. Capitol extensions, state capitals in the Midwest, European opera houses, Russian administrative buildings, World's Fair pavilions. The repetition is not random. Monumentality is the common denominator. The next layer of the claim is administrative. It suggests a coordinated effort. New governments allegedly issued revised blueprints. New architects were attached retroactively. Fires, wars, and accidental demolitions are framed as cleanup operations. But before evaluating documentation, one detail matters more than stone. When does the rebranding accusation first appear in writing? Because buildings from the 1800s are easy to find. Photographs exist. Blueprints exist. Newspaper announcements exist. What is harder to locate is the first instance where someone explicitly states, "This was not built, it was reassigned." The narrative often projects itself backward. It implies that suspicion existed immediately after construction, that contemporaries doubted the official story. The record suggests otherwise. When I filtered early internet archives, I noticed something consistent. The language of rebranding intensifies after 2016. Earlier alternative history forums discuss lost civilizations, yes, Mudflood occasionally. But direct architectural reassignment appears later, more structured, more systematic. This does not invalidate the claim. It locates it, and location matters. Because if the accusation of historical rewriting emerges in the digital era, then the architecture is older than the accusation. The buildings predate the suspicion. The suspicion does not predate the buildings. That distinction is rarely addressed in viral threads. Instead, the visual argument dominates. A side-by-side of ornate 19th century stonework and an assumed primitive frontier society. The implied mismatch fuels the theory. The aesthetic feels displaced in time. But aesthetic displacement is not documentation. So, Part 1 isolates the claim in its modern form. The Tartaria framework asserts that 19th century monumental architecture was inherited from an old world civilization and later administratively rewritten. The evidence presented in support is visual scale, construction speed, and perceived archival gaps. The next step is not to accept or reject. The next step is to open the earliest archive entry where this specific accusation is made, and read it, line by line. Because this is where the paper trail begins, and where the silence, if there is one, should appear. I did not start with cathedrals. I started with timestamps. If the claim is that 1800s buildings were rebranded, then the first job is to find the first time someone wrote that idea down, in that form, and tied it to Tartaria or the Old World. The record splits in two. One line is older and boring. Tartary as a label on early modern maps. A historical exonym. A geography term that drifts across centuries. That thread has nothing to do with courthouses in Ohio. The other line is newer and viral. Tartaria as a lost global empire. Mudflood as the reset mechanism. Architecture as the leftover evidence. That is the line this video tracks. So I search for the words people actually use today. Rebranded, reassigned, history rewritten, not built. Then, I looked for the earliest public trace where those words attach to 19th century structures. The earliest clear hits are not from the 1800s. They are not even from the early internet. They appear in the comment-era web. A 2018 Reddit thread asks for an explanation of Mudflood theory. The author writes as if the idea is already circulating and links to a video as the entry point. The tone is exploratory, not doctrinal. It reads like a newcomer trying to map a rumor. Around 2020 to 2021, the language tightens. In a 2022 Reddit comment, the claim is stated bluntly. Ancient buildings we see today were used as free energy and then rebranded churches after a global reset. That is the word, rebranded, not metaphor, administrative action. That matters because Tartaria content existed earlier, but the specific accusation of reassignment is later. Earlier posts argue old maps prove an empire. They argue star forts are not forts. They argue world fairs were impossible. But the rebrand framing turns those fragments into a single mechanism. Rename the past. You can watch the same compression on YouTube. Mudflood playlists and History Has Been Rewritten titles show up. Then the same image set repeats. Sunken windows, exposition palaces, city halls, before and after demolition shots. The visuals stay stable, the wording becomes sharper. This is the first pattern I flagged. The narrative hardens after it finds reusable visuals. The second pattern is platform drift. Early traces sit in comments, forums, and niche channels. Then they migrate to short-form clips and image posts where context is stripped. A finished building photo plus a sentence. Temporary? Why demolished? Who built this? The question format is not caution, it is a weapon. And then comes the illusion of age. Once a claim is repeated long enough, it feels older than it is. Viewers assume the argument has an archival pedigree because the architecture looks archival. The building is 1888, so the suspicion feels 1888. But the record says the suspicion is modern. I tested this by searching backward for the exact phrasing. Rebranded as temporary exhibits, reassigned dates, new architects attached. In most cases, the line returns to the same decade and the same ecosystem, late 2000s 10s into early 2000s 20s. That does not settle the claim. It sets the clock. Part 2 is not who built it, it is who said it first. Because if the accusation of rebranding is recent, then we have to treat it as a modern narrative artifact. It can still point to real anomalies. It can still be wrong, but it is not an old whisper in the archive. It is a new sentence, repeated until it sounds like a memory. I also looked for bridges into wider audiences. In September 2021, Wither Tartaria appears on Astral Codex 10, treating Tartaria as a meme about future people misreading our ruins. It is not endorsing the Empire story, but it shows the key word had reach. On the niche side, older footprints exist, but they use different glue. A Steemit post tagged Tartaria and Mudflood sits 7 years back, framed as personal discovery. Facebook groups show Mudflood shares from 6 years ago, often attaching Tartaria to specific forts or buildings. They spread by screenshots, not citations. What I did not find in the early traces is a stable list of sources. Links rot. Images detach from their archives. A post claims no construction photos, but never checks engineering reports. The narrative is built from the feeling that documents are missing. That is the paradox. The claim is they rewrote the record. The method is assume the record is rewritten. So the first trace is not one post. It is a shift in phrasing, from this looks old to this was reassigned. Next, I'm going to pull the earliest posts where this wording appears and read what they cite. The first record is a sentence, and every sentence leaves a paper trail. Once the phrasing stabilizes, the spread accelerates, not the buildings, the wording. Rebranded, reset, not built, temporary. The same cluster of terms begins to attach to the same cluster of images. That is not random, that is replication. I mapped which visuals repeat most often inside the Tartaria and Old World ecosystem. 3 categories dominate. First, World's Fair architecture, the White City, temporary exposition palaces, grand domes built for exhibitions and later demolished. The demolition becomes central. Why destroy it? The official explanation, temporary materials, is reframed as cover. Second, state capitals and city halls in the American Midwest, massive stone structures completed between 1870 and 1910. The claim focuses on population numbers and implied labor shortages. Too grand for the time. The absence of viral construction photos fuels suspicion. Third, sunken windows, mudflood imagery. buildings where the lower level sits partially below modern street grade. The visual is simple and powerful. A single photograph suggests buried history. These three image sets circulate across platforms: cropped, filtered, captioned, reposted without source. That is the spread pattern. Early posts ask questions. Later posts assert mechanisms. At first, it is aesthetic doubt. This looks older. Then it becomes administrative accusation. They reassigned it. The shift happens gradually. I compared language from 2017 to 2023 across forums, YouTube titles, and short-form captions. In earlier traces, Tartaria is often discussed separately from architecture. By 2021, architecture becomes the physical proof. By 2022, the word rebrand appears with confidence, not curiosity. Another pattern emerges: escalation through montage. Short videos stack images rapidly. Opera houses in Europe, railway stations in Russia, courthouses in the United States. The viewer is not given blueprints or engineering reports, only finished facades. The argument relies on cumulative scale. One building may be plausible, 20 feel impossible. Scale becomes persuasion. But scale is not documentation. Then there is the demolition motif. Buildings that were torn down, exposition halls, early train stations, ornate civic structures, become emotional anchors. The narrative asks, why destroy something so beautiful? The official reasons: fire damage, maintenance cost, temporary materials, are mentioned briefly, then dismissed. Demolition becomes motive. In several viral threads, I noticed a recurring move. A historic photograph of scaffolding is ignored, but a photograph of rubble is amplified. The rubble image suggests concealment. The scaffolding image suggests construction. One fuels the theory, the other interrupts it. Selective framing is part of the spread. Another shift: the introduction of coordination. Early posts imply incompetence or ignorance. Later posts imply intent. A coordinated reset. A deliberate rewriting of plaques, archives, and architectural credits. The narrative moves from anomaly to conspiracy. That escalation increases engagement. The more centralized the alleged operation, the more dramatic the story. And drama spreads faster than ambiguity. Platform mechanics reinforce this. Algorithms reward high contrast claims. A caption reading, "built in 3 years," travels further than construction timeline debated. Visual shock outperforms nuance. I also tracked cross-language spread. English-language Tartaria content feeds into Russian-language discussions. European buildings enter American threads. The narrative globalizes. A courthouse in Iowa sits beside an opera house in Vienna. Geography dissolves. But when geography dissolves, context dissolves with it. Local building practices, regional stone availability, labor records, industrial capacity. These details rarely survive the repost. Instead, the image survives. The record becomes secondary to repetition. By 2023, the spread pattern shows maturity. The same handful of buildings appear across dozens of channels. The wording becomes standardized, inherited, reassigned, rebranded. The claim stabilizes into a formula. That formula is powerful because it is simple. See building, note scale, question feasibility, assume prior civilization, assign motive. It is narratively efficient. But narrative efficiency is not the same as archival continuity. Part 3 is not about proving or disproving the claim. It is about understanding how it achieved coherence. how scattered doubts became a structured accusation. Because once a pattern feels coherent, it feels inevitable. And inevitability is persuasive. The next question is not how the story spreads. It is what survives when the story meets construction records, budget reports, engineering journals, and restoration files. That is where repetition ends, and where the archive speaks, or does not. Part 4 begins where the visuals stop working. If the claim is rebranding, the test is not aesthetics. The test is paperwork. So I switch sources, not compilations, not montages, not captions. I looked for the boring material that tends to survive institutions: procurement, contracts, permits, engineering notes, tenders, budgets, insurance, lawsuits, maintenance, restoration. Because a reassigned building still has friction with reality. Stone has invoices, labor has payroll, construction has delays, fires have claims, renovations have bids, bureaucracy leaves residue. The Tartaria and Old World narrative often treats the record as a single wall that was rewritten once. But in practice, records are layered. City archives, state archives, trade journals, newspapers, private contractors, photographers, insurance companies, courts, multiple ledgers in multiple hands. To rebrand a building retroactively, you would need to control more than plaques. You would need to align many independent trails. That does not make it impossible. It changes the scale of the allegation. So what survives? For many 19th century civic buildings, you can find public announcements of tenders and bids in newspapers. You can find reports of cornerstone ceremonies. You can find civic committee minutes. You can find architect names appearing during the construction period, not only after. That is a key distinction. The rebranding claim implies the architect credit was attached later. But in many cases, architect and contractor names show up while the building is still incomplete, discussed as a current project, with costs and delays. The second category is architectural journals and trade publications. In the 1800s, professional journals documented major projects. Not all, not everywhere, but enough to show a pattern. Buildings were treated as contemporary engineering problems, not mysterious inheritances. The third category is restoration. A lot of evidence in viral posts is a present-day photo of a building that looks impossibly clean, with sharp stone edges, as if it never weathered. That can be renovation, facade replacement, cleaning, repointing, reconstruction after fire. The record of restoration often exists, even if the record of original construction is patchy, and patchiness is real. This is where the Tartaria narrative finds oxygen. Archives burn, documents rot, municipal records get lost, small-town paperwork disappears, photographs are uneven. Some buildings have rich documentation, others have gaps. But a gap is not a mechanism by itself. The honest question is, what kind of gaps are we seeing? If you claim no construction photos, that is often a platform gap, not an archive gap. Many construction images exist in local historical societies, library collections, or newspapers, but they are not in the viral compilation. The absence is curated. However, there are cases where early-stage images are genuinely scarce. Reasons are mundane but powerful. Photography was expensive, not every site was photographed, and preservation priorities changed. A city might archive the finished building as civic pride and ignore the scaffolding as unglamorous. The record does not always preserve process, it preserves outcome. So, what remains of the Tartaria claim after contact with documentation? Two parts survive as questions. First, why does monumental classicism appear so consistently in the 1800s across different countries? That is a real pattern, but it has documented explanations. Revival styles, academies, state symbolism, imperial language, industrial production enabling ornament at scale. None of that requires inheritance, but it does require context that short-form posts remove. Second, why do certain buildings feel out of place relative to the popular image of the era? That is often a problem of comparison. People compare frontier photographs to capital city architecture and assume a single baseline. The record shows multiple baselines. Industrial hubs and state capitals had different capacities than rural towns. What does not survive cleanly is the strongest version of rebranding as a coordinated retroactive rewrite of authorship and dates across many independent archives. The allegation is large. The required control is larger. This is not a verdict. It is weighting. A careful framing looks like this. The Tartaria and Old World narrative is strongest when it points to real archival gaps, real demolition, and real repetition of styles. It becomes speculative when it turns those observations into a single global administrative act without showing the cross-institution paper trail. So the open question is precise. Not, were they hiding a lost empire, but where exactly does the documentary trail break, and does it break in the same way across different cities, agencies, and independent publications? If the break is consistent, that is a pattern. If the break is inconsistent, that is normal history. Either way, the correct place to argue is not the facade, it is the record, and the silence inside it.